Agricola, leading the rest of Gwent's army in alliance with Owain of Dumnonia, had driven Gorfethid's invaders back into Powys' hills. Then a messenger came from Gunlius, which said that Gorfethid of Powys was seeking peace, and the messenger threw 2 captured Powisian swords at Norwenna's feet as a token of her husband's victory. Better still, the man reported, Gunlius of Siluria was even now on his way south to collect his bride and her precious son. It was time, Gunlius said, that Mordred was proclaimed king on Caer Cadern. Nothing could have been sweeter to Norwenna's ears, and in her gladness she gave the messenger a heavy gold bracelet before sending him south to pass on her husband's message to Bedwin and the council. "Tell Bedwin," she ordered the messenger, "that we shall acclaim Mordred before the harvest. God speed your horse." The messenger rode south, and Norwenna began preparing for the acclamation ceremony at Caer Cadern. She ordered the monks of the Holy Thorn to be ready to travel with her, though she peremptorily forbade either Morgan or Nimue to attend, because from this day on, she declared, Dumnonia would be a Christian kingdom, and its heathen witches would be kept far from her son's throne. Gunlius's victory had emboldened Norwenna, encouraging her to exercise an authority that Uther would never have allowed her to wield. We waited for Morgan or Nimue to protest their exclusion from the ceremony of acclamation, but both women took the prohibition with a surprising calm. Morgan, indeed, simply shrugged her black shoulders, though at dusk that night she carried a bronze cauldron into Merlin's chambers, and there secluded herself with Nimue. Norwenna, who had invited the head monk of the Holy Thorn and his wife to dine on the Tor, commented that the witches were brewing evil, and everyone in the hall laughed. The Christians were victorious. I was not so sure of their victory. Nimue and Morgan disliked each other, yet now they were closeted together, and I suspected that only a matter of the direst importance could bring about such a reconciliation. But Norwenna had no doubts. Uther's death and her husband's victories were bringing her a blessed freedom, and soon she would leave the Tor and assume her rightful place as the king's mother in a Christian court, where her son would grow in Christ's image. She was never so happy as on that night when she ruled supreme, a Christian in the heart of Merlin's pagan hall. But then Morgan and Nimue reappeared. There was silence in the hall as the 2 women walked to Norwenna's chair, where, with due humility, they knelt. The head monk, a small fierce man with a bristling beard who had been a tanner before converting to Christ, and who still stank of the dung needed by his former trade, demanded to know their business. His wife defended herself from evil by making the sign of the cross, though she spat as well, just to be sure. Morgan answered the monk from behind her golden mask. She spoke with unaccustomed deference as she claimed that Gunlius's messenger had lied. She and Nimue, Morgan said, had peered into the cauldron and seen the truth reflected in its watery mirror. There was no victory in the north, nor was there defeat there either. But Morgan warned that the enemy was closer to Innis Widren than any of us knew, and that we should all be ready to leave the Tor at first light and seek safety deeper inside southern Dumnonia. Morgan spoke the words soberly and heavily, and when she had finished, she bowed to the Queen, then bent awkwardly forward to kiss the hem of Norwenna's blue robe. Norwenna snatched the robe away. She had listened in silence to the dour prophecy, but now she began to cry, and with the sudden tears came a wash of anger. "You're just a crippled witch," she screamed at Morgan, "and want your bastard brother to be king. It won't happen. You hear me? It will not happen. My baby is king." "Hey, lady," Nimue tried to intervene, but was immediately interrupted. "You're nothing!" Norwenna turned on Nimue savagely.
You're nothing but an hysterical, wicked child of the devil. You've put a curse on my child. I know you have. He was born crooked because you were present at his birth. Oh, God, my child!"
She was screaming and weeping, beating her fist on the table as she spat her hatred at Nimue and Morgan.
"Now go! Both of you go!"
There was silence in the hall as Nimue and Morgan went into the night. And next morning it seemed Norwenna must be right, for no beacons blazed on the northern hills. It was indeed the most beautiful day of that beautiful summer. The land was heavy as it neared harvest, the hills were hazed by the somnolent heat, and the sky almost cloudless. Cornflowers and poppies grew in the thorn thickets at the tor's foot, and white butterflies sailed the warm air currents that ghosted up our patterned green slopes. Norwenna, oblivious to the day's beauty, chanted her morning prayers with the visiting monks, then decreed she would move from the Tor and wait for her husband's arrival in the pilgrims' chambers in the shrine of the Holy Thorn.
"I have lived among the wicked too long,"
she announced very grandly, as a guard shouted a warning from the eastern wall.
"Horsemen!"
the guard cried.
"Horsemen!"
Norwenna ran to the fence, where a crowd was gathering to watch a score of armed horsemen crossing the land bridge that led from the Roman road to the green hills of Innis Widrin. Legesak, commander of Mordred's guard, seemed to know who was coming, for he sent orders to his men to allow the horsemen through the earth wall. The riders spurred through the wall's gate and came towards us beneath a bright banner that showed the red badge of the fox. It was Gunlius himself, and Norwenna laughed with delight to see her husband riding victorious from the war with the dawn of a new Christian kingdom bright upon his spear point.
"You see?"
She turned on Morgan.
"You see? Your cauldron lied. There is victory."
Mordred began to cry at all the commotion, and Norwenna brusquely ordered him given to Ralla. Then she demanded that her best cloak be fetched, and a gold circlet placed upon her head, and thus, dressed as a queen, she waited for her king before the doors of Merlin's hall. Legesak opened the Tor's landgate. Druiden's ramshackle guard formed a crude line, while poor mad Pellinor shrieked in his cage for news. Nimue ran towards Merlin's chamber, while I went to fetch Howl, Merlin's steward, who I knew would want to welcome the king. The 20 Silurian horsemen dismounted at the Tor's foot. They had come from the war, and so they carried spears, shields, and swords. One-legged Howl, buckling on his own great sword, frowned when he saw that the druid Tanaburs was among the Silurian party. "I thought Gunlius had abandoned the old faith," the steward said.
"I thought he'd abandoned Ladwis,"
Gudavan the scribe cackled, then jerked his chin towards the horsemen, who had begun to climb the Tor's steep, narrow path.
"See?"
Gudavan said. And sure enough, there was one woman among the leather-armoured men. The woman was dressed as a man, but had her long black hair flowing free. She carried a sword, but no shield, and Gudavan chuckled to see her.
"Our little queen will have her work cut out competing with that imp of Satan."
"Who's Satan?" I asked, and Gudavan gave me a buffet on the head for wasting his time with stupid questions. Howl was frowning, and his hand was clasped about his sword's hilt, as the Silurian warriors neared the last steep steps that climbed to the gate, where our motley guards waited in 2 ragged files. Then, some instinct that was still as sharp as when he had been a warrior tugged at Howl's fears.
"Legesak!"
he roared.
"Close the gate! Close it now!"
Legesak drew his sword instead. Then he turned and cupped an ear as though he had not heard Howl properly.
"Shut the gate!"
Howl roared. One of Legesak's men moved to obey the order, but Legesak checked the man and stared at Norwenna for orders instead. Norwenna turned to Howl and scowled her displeasure at his order.
"This is my husband coming," she said. "Not an enemy."
She looked back to Legesak.
"Leave the gate open," she commanded imperiously, and Ligesak bowed his obedience.
Howl cursed, then clambered awkwardly down from the rampart and limped on his crutch towards Morgan's hut, while I just stared at that empty, sunlit gate and wondered what was about to happen. Howl had scented some trouble in the summer air, but how I never did discover. Gunlius reached the open gate. He spat on the threshold, then smiled at Norwenna, who was waiting a dozen paces away. She raised her plump arms to greet her lord, who was sweating and breathless, and no wonder, for he had climbed the steep tor dressed in his full war gear. He had a leather breastplate, padded leggings, boots, an iron helmet crested with a fox's tail, and a thick red cloak draped about his shoulders. His fox-blazoned shield hung at his left side. His sword was at his hip, and he carried a heavy battle-spear in his right hand. Ligesak knelt and offered the king the hilt of his drawn sword, and Gunlius stepped forward to touch the weapon's pommel with a leather-gloved hand. Howl had gone into Morgan's hut, but now Sebille ran out of the hut, clutching Mordred in her arms. Sebille? Not Ralla? I was puzzled by that. And Norwenna must also have been puzzled, as the Saxon slave ran to stand beside her with little Mordred, draped in his rich robe of golden cloth. But Norwenna had no time to question Sebille, for Gunlius was now striding towards her. "I offer you my sword, dear queen," he said in a ringing voice, and Norwenna smiled happily, perhaps because she had not yet noticed either Tanaburs or Ladwis, who had come through Merlin's open gate with Gunlius's band of warriors. Gunlius thrust his spear into the turf and drew his sword. But instead of offering it to Norwenna hilt first, he held the blade sharp tip towards her face. Norwenna, unsure what to do, reached tentatively to touch that glittering point.
"I rejoice at your return, my dear lord," she said dutifully, then knelt at his feet as custom demanded. "Kiss the sword that will defend your son's kingdom," Gunlius commanded, and Norwenna bent awkwardly forward to touch her thin lips to the proffered steel. She kissed the sword, as she had been commanded, and just as her lips touched the grey steel, Gunlius rammed the blade hard down. He was laughing as he killed his bride, laughing as he slid the sword down past her chin into the hollow of her throat, and still laughing as he forced the long blade down through the choking resistance of her writhing body. Norwenna had no time to scream, nor any voice left to scream with, as the blade ripped through her throat and was rammed down to her heart. Gunlius grunted as he drove the steel home. He had slung his heavy war shield so that both his leather-gloved hands were on the hilt, as he pushed and twisted the blade downwards. There was blood on the sword, and blood on the grass, and blood on the dying queen's blue cloak, and still more blood as Gunlius jerked the long blade violently free. Norwenna's body, bereft of the sword's support, flopped sideways, quivered for a few seconds, and then was still. Sebille dropped the baby and fled screaming. Mordred cried aloud in protest, but Gunlius's sword cut the baby's cries short. He stabbed the red blade down just once, and suddenly the golden cloth was drenched with scarlet. So much blood from so small a child. It had all happened so fast. Godovin next to me was gaping in disbelief, while Ladwis, who was a tall beauty with long hair, dark eyes, and a sharply fierce face, laughed at her lover's victory. Tanaburs had closed one eye, raised one hand to the sky, and was hopping on one leg, all signs that he was in sacred communion with the gods as he cast his spells of doom, and as Gunlius's guards spread into the compound with levelled spears to make that doom reality. Ligesak had joined the Silurian ranks and helped the spearmen massacre his own men.